Hello, my name is Nick Heasters. I am the Senior Advisor for Cybersecurity for the HHS Office for Civil Rights. OCR is the federal agency responsible for administering and enforcing the HIPAA rules. This is the set of rules that applies to protected health information and sets forth the privacy and security requirements that HIPAA-covered entities and business associates, collectively regulated entities, must follow, as well as the rights that individuals have, such as the right to access their health information. We do this through rulemaking and guidance, investigations and enforcement actions, and outreach. Today, I would like to discuss the 2021 HITECH Act amendment that adds a requirement for OCR to consider regulated entities' implementation of recognized security practices, or RSPs, in certain OCR HIPAA compliance and enforcement activities. In June, OCR announced that we would be producing a pre-recorded video presentation for HIPAA-regulated entities on recognized security practices as set forth in the HITECH Act. This presentation is intended to educate HIPAA-regulated entities on the categories of recognized security practices and how entities may demonstrate implementation. In this webinar, I will discuss the 2021 HITECH Amendment regarding RSPs, how HIPAA-regulated entities can adequately demonstrate that RSPs are in place, how OCR is requesting evidence of RSPs, resources for information about RSPs, and OCR's request for information, the RFI, on RSPs. Additionally, in June, we solicited questions from the public and the regulated industry on recognized security practices, and we will answer a selection of questions at the end of this video. The HITECH Amendment was signed into law on January 5, 2021, and requires that OCR take into consideration the recognized security practices that a regulated entity has had in place for the previous 12 months. When OCR is making determinations regarding fines, called civil money penalties, audits, or other agreed-upon remedies, such as resolution agreements OCR may reach with a regulated entity to resolve potential violations of the HIPAA security rule. The HITECH Amendment defines recognized security practices by identifying three categories of RSPs. First, the standards, guidelines, best practices, methodologies, procedures, and processes developed under Section 2C15 of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST Act. Entities choosing this RSP may do so by implementing cybersecurity practices and controls in alignment with NIST's cybersecurity framework. The cybersecurity framework consists of 5 functions: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, and includes various subcategories and categories for implementation. Examples include asset management, governance, risk assessment, and risk management categories for the identify function. Protect includes categories such as identity management and access control, awareness and training, and data security. Response includes categories on response planning, communications, analysis, and mitigation. NIST Cybersecurity Framework website at nist.gov/cyberframework includes documentation that provides informative references for implementing individual framework subcategories such as NIST Special Publication 853 and ISO 27001. Second, approaches promulgated under Section 405D of the Cybersecurity Act of 2015. Entities choosing this RSP may do so by implementing cybersecurity practices and sub-practices from the Health Industry Cybersecurity Practices Managing Threats and Protecting Patients, HICP or HICCUP, technical volumes. The first technical volume is directed to smaller entities, while Volume 2 is directed to medium and large-sized organizations. The technical volumes include cybersecurity practices and sub-practices such as asset management, endpoint protection, vulnerability management, and incident response, and third, the other programs and processes that address cybersecurity and that are developed, recognized, or promulgated through regulations under other statutory authorities. This is sometimes referred to as the other category. Entities selecting this RSP may do so by implementing cybersecurity practices and controls from a cybersecurity program or framework that is explicitly recognized by statute or regulation. OCR will request regulatory or statutory citations from entities choosing other recognized security practices showing they were developed, recognized, or promulgated by statute or regulation. So there are three categories of recognized security practices that a regulated entity can implement that OCR will consider: NIST, Section 405D of the Cybersecurity Act, and other. At the end of this presentation, under Recognized Security Practices Resources, we have included links to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and Section 405D of the Cybersecurity Act of 2015, so these RSPs can be further studied and reviewed. Regulated entities wishing to have their recognized security practices considered by OCR must adequately demonstrate that they have had RSPs in place for the previous 12 months. It is important to note that implementing RSPs is an entirely voluntary process. The purpose of the HITECH Amendment is to incentivize the regulated industry to improve their cybersecurity by implementing recognized security practices. OCR will only consider the implementation of recognized security practices as a mitigating factor in security rule investigations and audits. The failure to implement recognized security practices will not be used as an aggravating factor in OCR investigations, and there is no liability for a regulated entity that has not implemented recognized security practices. If anyone is interested in seeing the language of the HITECH Amendment on recognized security practices, the link at the bottom of this slide goes to the text of the HITECH Amendment. How is OCR implementing this new HITECH Amendment? OCR began implementing the consideration of recognized security practices last year in OCR audits of security rule compliance or in investigations involving potential violations of the security rule that OCR seeks to resolve with a resolution agreement and corrective action plan, or civil money penalty. OCR will invite a regulated entity to voluntarily present evidence of implemented recognized security practices by sending a data request to the regulated entity. This data request serves several purposes. For one, it notifies the entity about the HITECH Amendment regarding the implementation of RSPs. This will increase awareness for regulated entities that have not implemented recognized security practices. Second, for entities that have implemented RSPs, it gives them written notice of the opportunity to present evidence of implementation for OCR to consider as a mitigating factor in security rule investigations. The data request also includes suggestions for how the entity can best present evidence demonstrating that it has implemented recognized security practices to OCR. The data request examples of evidence of implementation of RSPs is only meant to be illustrative, not comprehensive or exclusive. An entity may provide any evidence it chooses to adequately demonstrate to OCR that it has implemented RSPs. Again, as a reminder, RSP implementation is strictly voluntary. There is no penalty for non-participation. OCR will not consider the failure to implement or lack of RSPs when making determinations about compliance with the HIPAA security rule or as an aggravating factor when considering potential remedies or a civil money penalty. If a regulated entity has implemented recognized security practices, the evidence must demonstrate that the RSPs are fully implemented. Here are a few important points about full evidence of implementation. First, plans to implement RSPs at a future date is not evidence of implementation. OCR needs to see evidence that recognized security practices are actively and consistently in use throughout the regulated entity's organization and have been for the previous 12 months. Second, merely having written recognized security practices absent actual implementation of the practices is insufficient. Implementation means the practices have been disseminated to necessary workforce members and the practices are actually being used by the entity. A binder of RSPs sitting on a bookshelf doesn't demonstrate that they have been implemented. Third, recognized security practices should be implemented throughout the enterprise. For example, it is not sufficient to implement RSPs for one workstation, one application, or only for a narrow slice of an entity's organization. Although OCR expects recognized security practices to be implemented throughout the enterprise, OCR notes that certain elements of RSPs may be tailored to combat specific threats or to target specific technologies. For example, if a regulated entity chooses to implement the cybersecurity practices and sub-practices enumerated in the 405D task groups, Health Industry Cybersecurity Practices Managing Threats and Protecting Patients, or HICP, the HICCUP documents, in accordance with the amendment's second category of recognized security practices. Certain cybersecurity sub-practices are directed at protecting against certain threats, such as freshly email systems, while others may target specific technologies, such as vulnerability management sub-practices for host and server-based scanning, as well as web application scanning. However, regulated entities should keep in mind that while certain sub-practices of a RSP may be directed to a specific function and doesn't have universal application, recognized security practices as a whole should be implemented in a manner that protects EPHI throughout a regulated entity's enterprise. I'd like to speak now about OCR's Recognized Security Practices data request. If a regulated entity receives a data request from OCR regarding the implementation of RSPs, there are certain things that OCR is seeking to assist OCR's determination of whether RSPs have been fully implemented. To start with, OCR wants to know what RSP has been implemented. As I've mentioned, there are three categories of recognized security practices: NIST, the Cybersecurity Act of 2015, and other. OCR's data request asks the regulated entity to identify which RSP has been implemented, as that will aid in OCR's evaluation of the recognized security practice. If a regulated entity identifies the third RSP category, other, as its chosen recognized security practices, the data request seeks a citation for this other recognized security practice. This is so OCR knows what other programs and processes that address cybersecurity that are developed, recognized, or promulgated through regulations under other statutory authorities have been implemented, and OCR can review what the regulated entity has submitted. The data request also asks for evidence supporting the regulated entity's implementation of specific elements of an RSP, such as NIST cybersecurity framework categories and subcategories, if the NIST category is chosen. HICCUP cybersecurity practices and subpractices, if the 405D category is chosen, or other cybersecurity framework controls if a bona fide framework recognized in statute or regulations from the other category is chosen. Regulated entities are also asked to notify OCR of a change in status in the implementation of its RSPs, and if there is additional, new, or updated evidence of RSP implementation, the regulated entity would like OCR to consider. In other words, the data request should be considered as a standing data request, and as a regulated entity adds or makes changes to their recognized security practices, they can continue to provide that information to OCR. Stated another way, a regulated entity doesn't only have one opportunity to provide evidence of implementation of recognized security practices. The RSP data request provides illustrative examples of the types of evidence and documentation that could be helpful for regulated entities to send to OCR to adequately demonstrate that RSPs have been implemented for the previous 12 months. The examples of evidence and documentation below and in the RSP data request are merely illustrative. They do not represent a comprehensive list of all possible examples or documentation types that a regulated entity may use to demonstrate its implementation of RSPs. A regulated entity may provide any evidence it chooses to OCR to demonstrate that it has implemented RSPs. Some examples of evidence enumerated in a data request include policies and procedures regarding the implementation of RSPs throughout the regulated entity's organization, project plans regarding RSP deployment and use, including meeting minutes, timelines, and approvals, diagrams and narrative details describing the deployment and use of RSPs, training materials provided to workforce members and attendance records of training sessions regarding the implementation of RSPs, application screenshots and reports showing RSP deployment and use, vendor contracts and statements of work regarding RSP deployment and use. Also, please remember, any supporting evidence and documentation should include dates to support the implementation of RSPs for the previous 12 months. On April 6, 2022, OCR published a request for information that included requests for public input that could help inform potential future guidance or rulemaking regarding RSPs. The RFI included questions on what RSPs regulated entities have implemented or plan to implement, how regulated entities ensure the implementation of RSPs throughout their organization, how regulated entities intend to demonstrate RSP implementation to OCR, the types of issues regulated entities encountered implementing RSPs. If you were able to provide comments, we thank you for your input. The comment period closed on June 6, 2022. OCR is now reviewing the comments received to consider whether future guidance or rulemaking would be beneficial to support the implementation of recognized security practices and improvements to the regulated industry's cybersecurity programs. The comments have been posted and may be viewed at regulations.gov. I want to make you aware of some different recognized security practices resources that are available. This page includes links to the HITECH Amendment so anyone can read the statutory change to the HITECH Act, as well as resources for the two specifically identified RSPs in the HITECH Amendment, NIST and the Cybersecurity Act of 2015. This slide lists several resources relevant to RSPs regulated entities may find useful. The 405D Health Industry Cybersecurity Practices Managing Threats and Protecting Patients documents. The first link goes to the main document, and the second and third links go to the accompanying technical volumes that detail cybersecurity practices and sub-practices for small, medium, and large organizations. NIST Cybersecurity Framework is the landing page for materials from NIST regarding the cybersecurity framework, and cybersecurity framework implementation materials from NIST's Online Informative References, or OLIR. Here are ways to connect with OCR on our website, how to join our privacy and security listservs, and Twitter. OCR's listserv announcements provide information on recent HIPAA settlements or impositions of civil money penalties and investigations, new HIPAA guidance, proposed and final rules, future webinars, cybersecurity newsletters, and much, much more. Other ways to communicate with OCR include via email at the address shown on a slide, ocrmail@hhs.gov, contacting OCR via phone at one of the numbers provided, or sending OCR a letter through the mail at its headquarters location in Washington, D.C. Now, I'd like to answer some of the questions we received in response to our June announcement about this video presentation. The first question is, what constitutes implementation throughout the enterprise? Example, servers, workstations, APIs. Regulated entities seeking to have OCR consider evidence of implementation of RSPs in accordance with the HITECH Amendment should implement RSPs throughout their enterprise and should present evidence showing adequate demonstration that the RSPs have been implemented. For example, on servers, workstations, mobile devices, APIs, and any other device or software as applicable to RSP implementation. Maintaining an accurate inventory of IT assets can assist a regulated entity in ensuring its implementation of recognized security practices is truly enterprise-wide. Indeed, many, if not most, recognized security practices include IT asset inventories as elements. 405D HIPAA cybersecurity practices include asset management and inventory practices for organizations of all sizes. The NIST cybersecurity framework includes an asset management category with subcategories for hardware and software inventories, as well as for mapping organizational data flows. Further, OCR's Summer 2020 cybersecurity newsletter, available on our website, identified the importance of maintaining an accurate IT asset inventory and how such an inventory is important for an entity's risk analysis process. As applicable to RSP implementation means to take into account the elements of recognized security practices that may be directed to specific technologies and threats. For example, it was previously noted that certain HIPAA cybersecurity sub-practices include activities directed at specific technologies, such as email systems, web applications, servers, and medical devices. Regulated entities implementing 405D HIPAA cybersecurity practices as their recognized security practices should take care that cybersecurity practices directed at such technologies are implemented, such as host and server-based scanning, as well as web application scanning, as stated in HIPAA sub-practices for medium-sized organizations in sub-practices 7MA and 7MB. Also, regulated entities are not expected to implement recognized security practices that are not applicable. For example, if a regulated entity has no medical devices, cybersecurity practices directed specifically at medical devices, such as HIPAA Cybersecurity Practice 9, need not be implemented to demonstrate that RSPs are in place. The next question is, will mappings to the NIST cybersecurity framework be acceptable? The NIST cybersecurity framework is accepted under the first definition of RSPs in the HITECH Amendment. OCR will review and consider evidence demonstrating implementation of NIST cybersecurity framework categories and subcategories regardless of the source of such implementations. OCR notes that NIST provides various informative references that could aid with implementation or mappings of implementations to the cybersecurity framework. However, a document enumerating a particular framework's mappings to cybersecurity framework subcategories alone would by itself be insufficient to demonstrate implementation. OCR expects evidence of actual implementation. Earlier in the presentation, various examples of evidence and documentation concerning the planning, deployment, and use of RSPs were discussed as means to assist a regulated entity in demonstrating implementation. These examples include contracts, statements of work, invoices, project plans, meeting notes and minutes, policies and procedures, system and application screenshots, configuration and log files, and diagrams and narrative details of implementations. As was previously noted, these examples are not exhaustive, but are merely illustrative. The next question is, some in the healthcare industry have referred to the HITECH Amendment as providing safe harbor in the event of a HIPAA violation along the lines that secured PHI provides safe harbor in the event of a breach. Can you comment on the accuracy of this assertion? Does the law provide relief from liability? The HITECH Amendment provides for the mitigation of civil money penalties and the remedies offered to resolve potential security rule violations. This is not the same thing as a safe harbor or immunity from liability for potential security rule violations. Regulated entities should not interpret the HITECH Amendment to mean that if they implement recognized security practices, they cannot be held responsible for potential security rule violations. OCR will consider RSPs that have been implemented for the previous 12 months as a mitigating factor in investigations involving the security rule. But OCR could still seek to resolve potential security rule violations with a monetary settlement, corrective action plan and resolution agreement, or a civil money penalty. In regard to audits, the HITECH Act provides that if a regulated entity has adequately demonstrated the implementation of RSPs for the previous 12 months, it may result in the early favorable termination of an audit. The next question is, there are 2 named recognized security practices in the regulation. Are there others? Many regulated entities seeking OCR consideration of RSP implementation identify the NIST Cybersecurity Framework or the 405D Task Group's HIPAA documents cybersecurity practices as their RSPs. OCR reviews and considers these implementations to be in accordance with the first and second categories of the HITECH Amendment's RSP definitions, respectively. Regulated entities claiming implementation of the third definition or other category of RSPs, as defined by the HITECH Amendment, will be asked in OCR's RSP data request to provide the statute or regulation that recognizes the other RSP chosen by the regulated entity. In such instances, OCR will review the regulated entity's statutory or regulatory citation to verify if it aligns with the HITECH Amendment. If OCR determines that another RSP qualifies as an RSP under the other category in the HITECH Amendment, we will look for ways to inform the public and the regulated industry through future notices, rulemaking, or guidance. The last question is, will OCR rely on 1. Self or third-party assessment reports, 2. Artifacts such as corporate policy documents and vulnerability scan reports based on specific OCR requests, or 3. A combination of the 2 approaches to provide the evidence of recognized security practices? OCR neither limits nor prescribes the types of evidence or documents a regulated entity may submit to OCR for consideration that it has had RSPs in place for the previous 12 months. To the extent that the aforementioned types of evidence, self or third-party assessments, policies and procedures, and vulnerability scans can adequately demonstrate the implementation of RSPs, OCR will review and consider such evidence. Additional examples of types of evidence and documentation that could be useful for demonstrating RSP implementation could include contracts, invoices, and statements of work with vendors assisting a regulated entity with implementation of RSPs, project planning documents including meeting notes and minutes, and runbooks or other documentation concerning the use of RSPs. Additional examples include the result or output of implemented RSPs. For example, if a regulated entity's chosen RSPs include elements concerning asset management or inventorying hardware and software, inventory documents conducted in a manner specified by the RSP could serve as evidence of implementation of those relevant RSP elements. If a chosen RSPs include server and web vulnerability scans, the results of such scans could serve as evidence of implementation of those relevant RSP elements. If chosen RSPs include mapping communication and data flow, documentation showing such mappings could serve as evidence of implementation of those relevant RSP elements. OCR thanks you for your questions and hopes this video presentation has been helpful. The implementation of RSPs is a great way to bolster a regulated entity's cyber defenses. Many of the elements in an RSP also implement requirements of the HIPAA security rule, which should assist regulated entities' compliance with the security rule. The HITECH Amendment offers a further incentive as it requires that OCR take into consideration the RSPs that a regulated entity has had in place for the previous 12 months when OCR is making determinations regarding civil money penalties, audits, or other agreed-upon remedies, such as resolution agreements OCR may reach with a regulated entity to resolve potential violations of the HIPAA security rule. As you can see, there are many benefits to implementing RSPs, and OCR encourages and supports regulated entities to consider making RSPs part of their cybersecurity program. Thank you for watching.
Produced by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.